If Kaitlin Armstrong used a passport other than her own, that would be a completely separate legal issue. That would be a completely separate legal issue. If Kaitlin Armstrong used a passport other than her own.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Kaitlin was afraid Colin could be a killer. That is the main insight that comes from part 2 of our analysis of the DATELINE documentary, The Last Ride. There's a moment in the second interview where the host asks, why did she run after an interview with the police? And this is dealing with the last 6.5 minutes of that documentary. And what Kaitlin's attorney says, he seems to come up with what feels like another whopper. Kaitlin was afraid of Colin. She was afraid that Colin could be a killer. Now, it's interesting that this particular legally sensitive quote isn't provided directly on camera by Kofa, but as voiceover narration by the host, Keith Morrison. Regardless, it seems to suggest a legal strategy here, doesn't it? That Kaitlin can't be the killer because Colin is, or might be. Well, there goes the theory that Colin might testify for or testify in support of Kaitlin, perhaps to try to salvage what he can out of the broken pieces of his life. Obviously, if Colin's going to be implicated in some way, Colin isn't going to be part of Kaitlin's defense in the way we initially thought he might be. Before we get to the rest of this analysis, and by the way, this is part 2 of 3. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started.
Her boyfriend of 3.5 years, her business partner, the person that she has lived with and made a life with, spent basically all day with homicide detectives being interrogated for murder. And Kate Armstrong is, as we can pretty well imagine, terrified.
Well, yes, but when you're terrified, you don't necessarily sell your car and travel to a foreign country. If Kaitlin went to New York and stayed in New York with her sister, and if she said to the authorities, hey, I'm over here, that would be different. But the authorities were looking for her, and everybody knew the authorities were looking for her, and Kaitlin knew the authorities were looking for her. And Kaitlin refusing to hand herself over. If Colin was the culprit, why didn't he become a fugitive? Why didn't he sell his motorbike? This motorbike that was also seen on CCTV. Why didn't he disappear? If Kaitlin was so afraid and so certain that Colin was the culprit, why not tell the police and help the police in their investigation? Wouldn't that be the normal thing that a reasonable person would do? But Kofa says, her entire world is destroyed and shaken. Everything that she had understood is gone. Well, not quite. If her boyfriend had killed some other girl, unbeknownst to Kaitlin, well then Kaitlin still had a job. She had properties. She had family in the USA. Her entire world isn't destroyed, just her life with one person. That doesn't mean she's going to leave Austin. When last did you break up, move out of your home and travel to settle in another country like the next day? Well, not quite the next day, but basically immediately.
It makes perfect sense that when her world is turned upside down, destroyed, and in a state of shock, she goes to Costa Rica to go do yoga stuff.
At this point, the host breaks in to lodge the obvious question. Doesn't she travel on someone else's passport? What's that about? Kofa says, if Kaitlin Armstrong used a passport other than her own, hold on, wait a second. That's a yes or no question. It's not an if. Did she use her sister's passport or not? Yes or no? Anyway, let's play that back a second time.
If Kaitlin Armstrong used a passport other than her own, that would be a completely separate legal issue.
If Kaitlin used her own passport. Well, if Kaitlin used her own passport flying from Newark, surely law enforcement would have been able to easily find her name, simply doing a digital search. Also, if she had her sister's passport with her. That's not if. Christine's passport was in Costa Rica. Caitlin's sister's passport was in Costa Rica. Christine wasn't. As far as I know, it was documented, it was photographed. So if that's a fact, how did it get there? Did it fly itself there? Anyway, let's allow Kofi a chance to finish his statement.
If Kaitlin Armstrong used a passport other than her own, that would be a completely separate legal issue.
Would it though? I suppose you could argue it's a totally separate legal issue, but of course you could also argue that it's part and parcel of the original legal issue. Couldn't you argue that as well? So here I feel a point is scored by the host where he says, so you do know, but you can't say. Kofi concedes it wouldn't be appropriate for him to comment. Well, I think if one does comment on it, it feels like it's problematic to the I was so scared I ran explanation. I don't remember ever breaking up with someone and using someone else's passport to fly away to some far-flung escape from reality. Scratch that. I've never ever used someone else's passport or even thought of it. Have you? Next, Morrison's gravel voice intones quizzically when he brings up the plastic surgery. Say these words and give the last word a quizzical higher pitch. Kofi's response to the plastic surgery is, prove it.
There's no evidence to indicate in any way that Kate Armstrong had any plastic surgery.
Well, I suppose you could do that with everything. You could say, do you have absolute evidence? Do you actually have video and the person kind of providing their identity and signature and signing a disclaimer or signing the opposite of a disclaimer, saying a kind of a confession every step of the way? The other thing is if you say there's no evidence to indicate in any way that Kate Armstrong had plastic surgery, couldn't you look at her nose? But then again, perhaps she lost weight in her nose and her nostrils more than in other places. I do think Kofi sort of reveals his hand when he has to deal with passport and the plastic surgery issue. He makes a fairly good case to start off with, but unless he can disconnect this narrative or perhaps disallow it from being heard in court, maybe it's prejudicial or whatever, it feels like it's an uphill battle for the defense and a sort of a downhill road for the state thus far, doesn't it? DATELINE points out an employee at the plastic surgery in Costa Rica is a potential witness, but only in photos and in the media in terms of seeing and kind of identifying Kaitlin based on, as I say, photos. The name on the document, which I think was found in Caitlin's locker, is Alison Page. Ali. But I suppose someone, perhaps law enforcement, planted that there, or perhaps someone else had surgery and gave it to Kaitlin, or maybe Kaitlin found a piece of paper lying on the ground, picked it up and intended to write a grocery list or a to-do list on the back. I've got to say, I find this fascinating because it's interesting to me how when presented with a particular narrative, you find an alternative reality in it. Some people are paid to do this and they're very successful at it. The problem in terms of an authentic narrative is separately you can break down each and every argument with speculative appeals. You can take each and every argument and say, you know what, there's not absolute proof of that. But when you put all of these strands together in an integrated form as a cohesive schema, it's difficult not to see how parts of the story fit together as a rope. Kofi's story of a terrified girl who doesn't have plastic surgery and doesn't use her sister's passport feels half believable, but also somewhat disjointed. And so, in conclusion, for me by far the biggest revelation in all of this is this idea of Colin as the murder suspect. Think of that as kind of an inversion. Is it an inversion? If so, it adds another dimension to Kaitlin because presumably it's something she believes or supports in some way. Otherwise, you'd think her own lawyer wouldn't say it. It also reinforces the sense that it's absolutely embedded into the story, the psychology of you at the expense of me. And you're not going to get the better of me. You're not going to be at my expense. Does that make sense? So I do wonder, is Colin lawyered up? If not, he might need to. Stay tuned for part 3 in this analysis. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.